Hello, everyone. Welcome to Tea with TPS, informal conversations with thought leaders in India and abroad. Today, our distinguished guest is Ambassador Gurjeet Singh, a very distinguished Indian diplomat who has served as ambassador to Ethiopia, Indonesia, and Germany. But more importantly, we work together in Africa. The only African posting I had was in Kenya, and there he was my deputy high commissioner. So we have started learning about Africa together, but he continued with his experience elsewhere, and now he has become an Africa expert. And this is known from the very interesting, very rather voluminous, well-researched book called the HARAMBEE Factor. It refers to the spirit behind India-Africa relations. So his canvas is much bigger than mine, in the sense that he is head of the Africa's division in the Ministry of External Affairs. He has traveled extensively in Africa, and he has been able to take a wholesome view of Africa as a whole. Africa, as you know, have several countries, very different from each other, rich and poor, sophisticated and unsophisticated, democracy and autocracy, all kinds of things in Africa. It's an entire continent. Very few of us know much about Africa. And when we were there, it was a very different scene what it is today. So what I'd like to explore with him, since we knew Africa of 1995 to 1997 when I was there, and he knows the Africa of today, as he has portrayed in the book. So the book presents an interesting characteristic of our relationship. And that is what the title of the book suggests. Harambee is a phrase used by Indian and Kenyan or African workers when they were doing major lifting. And it is believed, though it is a Swahili word, it is believed that Hari and Amba, the two, divine personalities whom they always remembered when they were doing hard work. I don't know if this is true story or not, but somehow this concern, the Indian interest in religion and the Kenyan interest in having a phrase which reflects that philosophy, I think it is a happy combination. So let me welcome Gurjeet to the show, and we hope we have a useful conversation which will also promote your book among people who may not have heard about it as yet. Welcome, Gurjeet.
Thank you so much, sir, for your gracious words and for having me today.
Good. So I know you've already been around talking about this book. I have heard several of your conversations, but we are in a particular situation where we are able to compare the two situations. And I think that advantage nobody else probably had. My own experience in Kenya was mixed in many ways. You know that I was attacked in my own home for no reason that I'm aware of. I often say that I did not have even time to make enemies when they attacked me there. I was only there 2 or 3 months. And it was a very serious attack. In fact, anybody else could have run away from there or done various things. But I persisted and insisted, in spite of the fact that the government of India asked me to go anywhere I wanted. But I insisted on staying because I said, out of the 30 million Kenyans, only 3 attacked me. So the rest of the people are with me, and I stayed on, and that was much appreciated by President Moi and others. So unlike some other diplomats who ran away whenever there was even a hint of such an attack. And that gave me certain advantages with the government and the Kenyans in general. They felt sorry for what had happened. But more importantly, I did not see the kind of warmth that I had expected in Kenya. Because India has been involved in the freedom struggles in Africa. We have been very supportive. We were the first to take up the issue of South Africa in the UN, creating a lot of misunderstanding about India violating the charter by bringing in an internal matter to the United Nations Security Council. And all that. So there's a huge background of India being very closely involved in Africa. But I did not see that reflected in the daily life. We were not a particularly important country in Kenya. They were more interested in donors like Japan or Korea, and also, of course, the big powers. And India was not a big player there. We did our job, whatever we can. You did a lot of trade promotion. I did considerable work in the UN and also tried to help UN to stay in Kenya. It was not a very easy thing to do. I remember the foreign minister telling me, about my High Commissioner, you are the one who should be able to tell them that Kenya is not unsuitable for the UN. And I laughed and said, shall I say it did not hurt me when I had blood oozing out of my body. So anyway, it was all, but from your book, I get the feeling that since I left the service, that is in 2004, magical things have happened. Very many important things have happened. And you even say that Africa is a priority for us. This was not the case. You know, we had a hard time getting attention from New Delhi when you write about Africa or Kenya. But if it is a priority, what caused that and who took the initiative and what were the steps? You, of course, outline many of them in the book, but for the sake of the listeners, I would like you to outline the main differences that have occurred in our relations with Africa, particularly in Kenya, since I left the continent and I left the service. Gurjit.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I remember that dark day when you were attacked. And it was just a week after my daughter was born. So it was, I think, for both of us personally, a very difficult time. But I remember the courage and bravery with which you bore the assault, which was life threatening, and your wife in turn. And I think that set an example for many of us that how in difficult places you have to have this courage. Not only an appetite for alcohol and protocol, but raw courage to take on the situation, which I think you admirably did. So I remember that very well. So I think you mentioned several things. So let me begin from where the book begins. The book tries to cover about 20 years or just 25 years of recent African history. And I bring out the same point which you mentioned, that, this thing about both India and Africa, the liberation movements, the non-aligned movement, standing with the liberation of South Africa, through apartheid. All these is really the past. There are no leaders in Africa who remember that or who are part of those movements. When we were in Africa, sir, there were still a few, but now there are none. The generation has passed. Secondly, two things happened around the time that we were in Kenya. One, the solid defeat by Japan of India in the UN Security Council election, where we thought Africa was for us and Africa was for where the money came from. And the second was 1998, when the South Africa that we had fought so hard for at the non-aligned summit turned and started wanting to talk about Jammu and Kashmir, criticizing our nuclear tests. This was felt like a betrayal by then Prime Minister Vajpayee. Now, I think both these incidents in 96 and 98 brought home to us that you need to develop your Africa policy differently, because things had become far more transactional rather than ideological. So whether you were still non-aligned or you had fought for their freedom or what Apa Panth meant in Kenya, all forgotten. So I think this transition took place around the time I was Joint Secretary Africa for the first time after my Kenya posting with you. But at that time, sir, it was the graveyard division. Anybody posted to that division was either on punishment or nothing else to do. But by the time I became JS and then AS Africa in 2009, it was in the middle of the two first and second India-Africa summits. Now this was a coveted division because there was so much happening there. So that transformation is what my book covers, what happened in that period. Very much so, sir. When you retired around 2004, that is the time India came up with the IDEAS program, the India Development and Economic Assistance Scheme, under which we started giving lines of credit at a much competitive rate. And we already had by 2002 the Focus Africa program. We started associating with Africa under its reformation. You know, the African Union was born in 2002, NEPAD came before that. So we were associated with this resurgence of Africa as a natural partner, and therefore it became much more economic. Now, two things in this economic interaction stand out. One is that India started providing concessional finance for long periods, 30 years concessional finance. And we were lending to the highly indebted poor countries who around 2002 had all their debt wiped out, the debt written off under the Paris Club. So this opened a new market, and through those lines of credit, India entered 41 countries, most of them LDCs and HIPC, and this allowed Indian business to enter those markets for the first time in many cases. I mean, where would you expect Indian projects in, say, Benin or Mauritania or Central African Republic, except for this facility? The second thing which you mentioned, sir, that in Kenya they didn't take us too seriously, is because I think we were in error. We never understood that how much Indian investment had come to Kenya or wider in Africa. So around 2003-4, we started aggregating this investment even if there were guess estimates. In our case, trade, ITEC program and LOC was the main thrust. But for most African countries, the FDI from India was the main thing. And this was never part of Indian government policy to promote FDI in Africa or for that matter anywhere else. So when we started saying, see how much we invested, this became the buzzword that Indians are big investors. And this made us look much bigger than we thought we were. And I think these two things together, the economic dimension grew. And finally, it comes to trade. From 2008, the nature of trade totally changed. In 2002, when we introduced the Focus Africa program, India-Africa trade was $2.5 billion. Today, it is around $70 billion. Around 2008, India started diversifying energy supplies. So the oil imports from West Africa and later the huge investments in gas and coal in Mozambique, brought in much more Indian FDI, changed the nature of trade, that Africa became a major economic partner. 2008 onwards, India is always in the top three trading partners of Africa. So this made the very big change happen, sir.
Yes, but how did it start? Was it an initiative from our side which they welcomed, or was it your experiencing or watching what other countries were doing in Africa? What ignited this new interest?
Yes, sir. So when the Cold War ended, the Africans were at a loose end. They didn't quite know how much to listen to the Europeans in particular and the Chinese, but both of them were coming with dollops of money, but often with conditions attached. Whereas when we started around 2003-4 with the LOCs, it was no conditions. And the trade grew, everything happened, and the African Union came on the scene. At 2004, when President Kalam went to Africa, he said, let's do this Pan-African e-network project, which I was fortunate to be the co-coordinator along with the African Union in Addis Ababa. And that was implemented in 47 countries as a grant program. It brought Indian education and Indian medicine to African hospitals and universities directly. This was a bit of a game changer. So this new complex of things that we were doing came a time when the African Union decided that besides the European Union, China and Japan, they needed new partners. And in 2006 at the Banjul summit, they passed a resolution to look for new partners in which India was the top partner. And this was because of the work we had done over the last 2-3 years before 2006 with the fledgling African Union. And they saw this. So the first partnership they launched was with India, and that is how the India Africa Forum Summit was born. And through that summit, much more grant, much more lines of credit, much more trade, investment, scholarships, everything came about. And over the three summits, we have put in about maybe $2.5 billion of grants, and about $20 billion of lines of credit were offered. Plus many scholarships, doubled, trebled, ITech program established, the Africa ITech set up. So it was a boom time, and because of the catalytical impact of Indian lines of credit and growing trade, Indian investors grew. I saw this in Ethiopia, which became the largest recipient of Indian LOCs. We saw that from about 40 million, Indian investment went to 4 billion. So Indian industry saw that where government of India was putting in money, it was a good time to trade and invest. Now this equation was all often challenged that it is not true. So in my book, I've done a calculation showing the three countries which use the LOCs the largest: Tanzania, Mozambique, and Ethiopia. And I've shown in those duration how trade and investment with them grew. So this correlation I have established in my book.
Well, talking about investments, you remember we had a Make in India exhibition, which was very successful. The Indian industry participated in a big way. And at that time, I had discussions with you were there too, discussions with all these people about investment, in Africa, particularly in Kenya. They made several interesting points. They said, we go to a country to invest, provided we get 25% profit. Okay, bottom line. Secondly, we should have comfortable arrangements for stay. Our family should have good facilities, education, etc. Then also a kind of receptivity of India and generally the interests of India being protected. So all these do not happen in Kenya, and therefore, sorry, we cannot come here. How did that situation change? Was it because the Chinese and the Europeans had made a headway? And if that is the case, how were you able to succeed in that competition? Because, you mentioned the Security Council election. President Moi told me to my face, I'm sorry, Mr. High Commissioner, I cannot vote for you because I'm getting $250 million from the Japanese for this particular vote. So, and they were as frank as that. And when Ambassador Krishnan came, he said the same thing to him. So they were not shy about talking about it because, as you said, transactional. So the transactionalism went against us during those days. So were we late in arriving in Africa, or do you think we had a head start in Africa before the Chinese and the Europeans became more active?
So the Europeans were always active as colonialists, and they then went into trade through the Lomé conventions, with the Africans, which said we will give you trade access provided you let us tell you how to run your countries. So, the governance angle was brought in, and that Africans agreed, but because they had no choice. And when the Chinese came and said, we will lend to you, but we will do it our way, they still accepted. But the Chinese actually came after us. The Chinese model is different and it came after. Our model was largely private sector led. And I must say, this is in hindsight. When the Indians came, they brought their philanthropy with them. You have seen so much of it in Kenya. They brought private trading with them. And this trading was all small and medium enterprise. So this model is what worked. And then the education and the health aspects. That India provided you good and competitively priced education and health. Now, when we look at Indian investment and what you recall having a discussion with the big guns, absolutely correct. The big guns did not see in Africa as a big market. It is only around 2010 that people start saying that Africa has a billion people who have consuming power, except they were not in one country. So the problem of a unified market was there. But the bulk of the Indian investment, which is there in my book, is actually small and medium enterprises, really small guys. Ethiopia was a great example. And they came with small investment. So even if they wanted that famous 25% profit, it was on a small base and therefore doable. It was only the Tatas who actually came in a big way once South Africa opened up around the time we were in Kenya. Otherwise, they were in Kenya, they were in Tanzania, but in small ways, Zambia. Now,
South Africa was a more sophisticated market.
More sophisticated. But it is around 2010 that Airtel and Godrej come in with huge investments. But these are acquisitions by both. Godrej in the hair care segment, I think today in 14 African countries, they have taken over the entire hair care market. And Airtel took over the assets of Zain and set up mobile telephony. And these were big investments. Same with the lines of credit. It allowed Indian companies to go into Africa, and the risk takers came first. The big companies were busy doing contracts in West Asia, Libya, Algeria. But when that dried up, then they started looking and started coming here. Meanwhile, Africa became better governed. There were more funds available, including through international funding. So, like, even Airtel was actually funded out of the Netherlands, not so much out of India. So, this trilateral, what I call, Indian company, African market, foreign funding, this idea came up. So, the nature of investment from India started to change. But I still believe that it is the small Indian company which actually turned the tide in our favor.
Okay, Gurjit, but talking about the presence of Indians in Africa right from the beginning, was it entirely positive for us? Because they learned to live with the Indians, they somehow exploited them and made good living out of them. And there was a certain amount of envy against the Indians because the Indian standard of living was far different from those of the Africans. And the Africans were doing menial work in the house, 8 people working in a man's house. Even puja is done by an African. And so they are dedicated so much. But one day they would sit together and say, why are we doing this? This is our country. And then they decides to kill the man and take away everything and run away. And that was the kind of atmosphere there was. And there was this atmosphere of crime, lack of law and order, no respect for human life. So as a result of it, Indians became more and more alienated from the society. So somebody asked me that when they hit you, did they say this hit is for so and so and use the Gujarati name? This is for that Shah. This is for that Patel. So wasn't there that kind of what shall we say, cooperation in a very tense situation, which could explode? And that atmosphere hopefully has gone with the new investors because they are not seen as exploiters probably. And this is what I would like to know. The Indian presence in Africa, has it started helping us in our own objectives?
So you were a great votary of diaspora policy and you associated with them very well, I think in Fiji, in Kenya, and wherever you went, I think even in the US. So I think you speak with authority on this cleavage on how we are seen. Indeed, what we called in Kenya the Asians, they carried this baggage of anxiety towards the Africans who felt threatened. But they also realized that this was the goose which laid the golden eggs. So today the goose is more valued, mainly because the new Indian investor who's come doesn't have that attitude towards the African, which was perhaps inculcated in the Asians over 3 generations. So that I think we come from a democratic India and there is a better acceptance of equality among newer Indians. And I think there is a study of the World Bank in 2008, I think, which says that of all the foreign investors in Africa, the Indians created the most local jobs, transferred the most technology, and contributed the most to local trade. So we were not just exporters who wanted production at all costs, which was different from the European and Chinese model, which were rather export oriented models. Ours were for local conditions, mainly because we were SMEs. So I think that respect is there, that I cannot understand the Chinese machine, and even if the Indian machine is more expensive, I prefer working with it. The philanthropy of the Indian owner is much more. Now they send my children to school, they give me medicine when required. So that image has changed. And also, I think, sir, the Indians are no more in the local trading where they came into clash with local Africans. The Chinese have gone into that space where they have gone with large numbers of people, and that is causing them that problem rather than us. So I think we are over that hump. And today, India's diaspora is actually very well placed to spearhead the Indian role, bring in Indian products, promote them, and bring goodwill to India. I think that is true in Mozambique, it is true in Ghana, it is true in many. Sir, you would be surprised in Gabon, there is an Indian owned company which has set up the biggest SEZ. And when I met the Gabon ministers in June, they were gaga about Indians saying we've never had such a wonderful community ever before. So there are changes because they come in with investment, create jobs, contribute to the economy. But yes, sometimes they do generate ill will, like of envy, and that can be problematic. But that can be anywhere. I mean, it's within India itself, and that I think.
Has the violence against Indians reduced in Africa, particularly Kenya?
So I think in Kenya, the violence is not now only directed at Asians. There is violence, but it is generally, I think the richer segments of Kenya have the same risk as anybody else. But in South Africa, in Durban, there were riots last year, and those had to be quelled. And those were against, but those Indians had nothing to do with India. They were local Indians who had done well and therefore came. So that envy, as I said, is a problem, but I don't think it necessarily is an Indian phenomena anymore.
Okay, coming to line of credit, you keep using LOC, all our listeners may not understand that. The line of credit idea is not new. We had offered lines of credit even our time, but nobody took it because they were saying that since you insist on Indian goods and services being used for the line of credit, they did not believe in it because they thought they had better lines of credit from Japan and Korea, etc., which were with no strings attached. They could go and buy anywhere. And therefore, ours was not even fully accounted for. We were offering lines of credit, but it was not being taken because they were comparing, like our scholarships. First priority is United States, second is UK, then Germany, and then comes India, low. And so they apply for the Indian scholarship, but if they get another scholarship, they go. And many who came to India did well, several prime ministers, presidents, etc. And still that did not have an attraction of the kind they had for Japan and Korea. So both in line of credit and education, where did the change occur and how?
So I think where the lines of credit are concerned, initially they were government to government lines. The Finance Ministry of India lent to the other country, and that was not a successful scheme. It is only when the ideas, what I mentioned, the India Development and Economic Assistance Scheme was born in 2003-4. That was a development cooperation scheme. So that reduced the interest rates, opened up, but yes, it did not open up the procurement from non-Indian sources. That till today, it is tight. So, but what happened around between 1991 and 2001, the Indian economy takes off. And more Africans
Then goods
realize,
became better.
yeah, that we have got good stuff, we are able to export, and they go. And so they start seeing India as a model they can emulate for its democracy, for its pluralism, for its emergent economy, and say, we can't be like China or we can't be like France, but India is a country we can be like. So that opens up a heart to heart engagement of the new generation of Africans. And that creates the ethos for the India Africa summits. Now, when you look at the new lines of credit, they come at a time when there is greater emphasis in Africa to build infrastructure, build industry. So, therefore, they are looking for money at lower rates. And as I mentioned, the debt write off happens around this time. So, we came in with our new idea scheme at the right time. Earlier they could not borrow because of debt stress. We have come to the same stage now, but that is how this championship really began, and we became great competitors. The other part which you rightly mentioned on education, that our total number of scholarships even now is only 1,000. But if you include the Pan-African E-Network, the ITEC, and all the other around it, the short-term scholarships, we are giving 50,000 scholarships a year, and most of them get utilized because we do many on-sites now. We do many by electronic means, and the ITEC program is very successful. But yes, it is not successful in every country. So I have suggested in my book that 18 new embassies have been opened in Africa. Now, these embassies should be development cooperation embassies. They should make sure that our ITEC is fully utilized, our scholarships are utilized, our grant projects are implemented. Even grant projects under the summit, sir. We had a map of Africa and Africa division where we put in which country did we have a project, whether funded by us or a grant, and where we were coming, and we found there were large gaps. So we said, let's start filling up the gaps by using the grants money that we have got from the summits. Unfortunately, most of the projects which never took off are still in those holes where nothing happened. And we have opened new embassies there. So we need to overcome those local issues, which requires dedicated work by embassies to overcome the inertia, lack of governance, putting things together. And I think we can make it work. So today, where LOCs are concerned, we are back to square one. There is debt stress in Africa. They don't want to borrow. They prefer the FDI-led model. So I have recommended in the book that the 15 years the LOC served you well. Many Indian companies acquired the gumption and experience to bid for World Bank and other projects in Africa, which is a big gain for us. But now we need to move towards dealing with the problem that Indian investors have and support them, because that is your trump card, the Indian FDI. And where education is concerned, more Indian investment into education in Africa. And fortunately, this has started to happen.
Are Indian universities going there or other institutions?
Not only Indian universities, some have gone, but many private Indian people have opened up their own universities. And
Yes, I know about it. Yes.
Recently in Ghana, Liberia, I've seen these happening. But yes, more Indian private universities which emerged in India also started going to Africa and bringing in students. So some of the largest student bodies are actually in private universities around Noida and Greater Noida.
No, we should establish IITs in Africa. That will be a big revolution.
Yes,
but of course, we are very reluctant on that. But ITEC program, I remember the disadvantage was that we insisted in participatory programs, in the sense that if we sent a doctor, they have to contribute his housing or some facilities, and we will meet the 90% cost. And they were asking, why should we find this 10% if I take it from Japan or Korea? We don't have it. We don't need to do that. It was a principle on our side. but it was seen as a disadvantage by the Africans. Has that changed now?
That has changed, but I don't think sending of experts is one of our success stories. It is basically bringing people to India and during COVID doing the e-tech, which has been more successful. But I did not address this issue which you mentioned about Korea and Japan. So while Korea and Japan were good at giving grants, they were not good at lending to Africa. They would give money to the Africa Development Bank,
Yeah,
but they
that
would
made them
not give
happier because it was free, without any
grant. But
condition.
they would do a focused grant program. Supposing a country's vote was important in the UN Security Council, they would fund that country. They would not fund across. Whereas we, whether it was through the Pan-African or ITEC or even the grant program that we did through the summits, we covered the whole of Africa. And our lines of credit went to the whole of Africa, but Japanese and Korean law did not allow them to lend beyond 8 to 10 countries, which were investment grade countries. We did not lend. So that was the difference. But in my book, I have recommended, sir, that it is now time for us to match transaction for transaction. They don't need to saturate our money all over Africa. The businessmen should look at which are the better governed and countries with better business ambience and invest there. Because now with the Africa Continental FTA, you have larger regional markets. So you don't have to invest only in Kenya to sell in Kenya. You can actually invest in South Sudan to be able to sell to Kenya. But depending if South Sudan is better. But I must tell you, sir, in the survey that I did, Kenya comes out as the number one country preferred by Indian investors even today. Number one, much more than South Africa. So I think that attitude of the Indian investor is different. But where Indian government is concerned, I still believe that we should look at the important international institutions, see which countries are going to be members for the next 2 or 3 years and deal with them for the time being, and the rest should be request based.
Well, you are focused mostly on economic and commercial matters. And how about the political part? Because one heard that the Chinese called a heads of government Africa meeting in Beijing, and 49 countries were represented. While none of those meetings that we held, there was more than 15 or so. Is that a comparison to be drawn?
So I think that is comparing, apples and oranges. The India-Africa summit was started under the Banjul formula, which said that there would be 15 African countries meeting with India. And that was to be the formula for African meeting with all individual countries. It's only when a continent-to-continent meeting was to be held, then all would come. But the Chinese FOCAC preceded the Banjul formula. But the Chinese don't do that summit regularly, sir. They do a ministerial meeting every 3 years, like in December 21 in Senegal. Their summit is an as and when we can leave. It is not a regular summit, but yes, they do coerce people. Please come now, you will get this. But if you see Japan, which also has a 3-yearly TCAD, and the last one was in Tunisia, they have stopped announcing how many came, basically to avoid this comparison. Now, India did the first.
Does it designate countries or a number only? They say 15 African countries, but not designated as such, is it? For
So
each
the
country.
formula, the Banjul formula has a plan. They have a plan that there are 5 permanent people who are the founders of the African Union. Then there are 8 regional economic communities. The country chairing that should be there. That makes 13. And the 2 others were the current and previous chair of the African Union. That made 15 plus the commission. So that was the formula which covered the whole of Africa. Now we did 2 summits under this formula. The 2015 summit, we invited everybody and we got a very large number of people. I think 44 heads of state or government and representatives from probably all 54. But I personally still believe that it is more functional to go back to the Banjul formula.
Right. How about people to people? You give considerable emphasis to that. And how does it work? Are there tourists coming into India? We are going there. How does this work apart from the old connections? Are there young people from India go there? Do they come here? Is there really an interaction? And also politically, how does it look? The African continent, because we don't hear much about any support being extended to India in the question of China or on the question of economic development of India, on our nuclear positions, etc. Are they fairly silent, or is it that such reactions do not emanate from these countries?
So when you have important issues like nuclear, any say political issue of international relevance, the pressure from China is stark and bullying. And they call in, I gave you this, now you do this. That is not our style. So we have
But who is
to.
more successful? That's the point.
Is more successful. So that is why I'm saying we should also become a little more transactional by focusing on countries which are important for the time and giving money. We have done it. In my book, there are one or two examples, but it's best not to reveal these, no, otherwise there's embarrassment. When the Chinese don't reveal it, but people who follow Africa, we understand where they did what and how they turned the boat. But coming to normal people to people, most African countries are not given the benefit of Chinese tourism, which, as you know, is an economic instrument, except I think South Africa. Now, Indian tourists help Eastern and Southern Africa a lot. There are big numbers. Secondly,
The safari route.
safari route, yes. But we wanted to set up an Indian volunteer corps in Africa, but that never took off. But there are many young Indians who go with international agencies to volunteer in Africa and come back with a changed impression that how it is not as bad as it looks and there is much more hope. But I think the biggest change comes from the travel of businessmen for trade and investment. When they go and come back, they say, my God, there is opportunity there. So I think the second chapter of my book is actually called The Opportunity Knocks, because I believe Africa is a great opportunity. And you are right when you mentioned earlier that there are difficulties. But I think to most small and medium Indian enterprises, they are not overawed by the difficulties of Africa. It is a big company who has to show a balance sheet from year one that has the problem. The small and medium enterprises in the small profits will lead to big profits. And even if your factory gets burned down, you will start again. And that entrepreneurial skill of Indians, I think, is what takes us through.
And technologies, how about computers and, kind of
That is a big thing. There is a big, among all the Indian grant projects, the IT centers, now called centers of excellence, they are doing a great job. In fact, in the success stories, almost all of them are IT centers. Morocco, Egypt, the Kofi Annan Center in Ghana become huge. And there's a
not a lot of
huge.
people have employment opportunities.
Yes, and I've shown how people come out of there and where they get employed. Interestingly, many of them get employed by Western aid agencies.
And also they get a stepping stone to United States by working in somewhere.
Yes, they do, correct. Especially the one in Ghana, the Kofi Annan Center, that has really expanded into smaller towns. Similarly, it's happening in Tanzania when we set up the first center. And then multiple offers started amalgamating and these centers kept getting bigger. One of the most successful centers is non-IT. It is the Entrepreneurship Development Center in Senegal, which started as a G15 idea and later got amalgamated into a proposal under the summits. And that has, I think, trained 6,000 people over the last few years. And they are training people all over Africa who speak French. So wherever government...
opportunities, people will go. There are
Yes,
still many unemployed engineers in India,
very true.
and it could be turned into a kind of place where people will go, at least for initial years, and then migrate to other countries. That possibility may be there.
So I
Anyway,
think Africa is a big opportunity. The time is now right before the next summit to reorient our approach, support Indian private sector more for civil society, for education, for investment, and you will find that it pays you rich dividends because in each of these countries, these people become important interlocutors into the local systems. In Kenya itself, sir, in our time, there was hardly one or two local Indian origin MPs. Last parliament in Kenya, there were 8. And this time, 11 contested, but I think they all lost.
anyway, finally, our own failures and failings. You do refer to some of them, bureaucratic problems, being not being able to, hit the iron when it is hot. And that criticism is there about India and Indian bureaucracy everywhere. The famous statement by the Burmese foreign minister, India is NATO, only talking, not doing. And you also reflect that in spite of your very bright picture that you have drawn of the situation, you also hint at some of these problems where we have not risen to the occasion. And in the review, Mr. Krishan Rana makes this very obvious. And he talks about our own failings with reference to your book and also Rajiv Bhatia's book. So, where do we stand on that? Have we risen to the occasion or have we been held back by our usual bureaucratic delays as well as some kind of prejudices vis-a-vis the African Parliament? Has it been overcome?
So I think in my book, there are no punches pulled because I was the additional secretary for Africa who set up the big plans for the second India Africa summit. And I had an approved cabinet note. And yet, ministries could not implement those projects.
Yes.
So, one of the things I interviewed a lot of the people currently dealing with those projects and say, why did they succeed or fail? And I have gone through this with a fine tooth comb. And one of the conclusions is that in my time, I had a team of dedicated, passionate people who were infected by our passion. And that so long as those people remained in the various ministries, the projects went through. And though the funding was there under a cabinet approval, the internal abilities of ministries to manage their own internal finance, their priorities, all that never really took off after the first shortlet of people went. So I have suggested that you should have dedicated cells. Now that MEA, for instance, has lateral entries who are not going to get posted outside, you should open implementing teams which should just be stationed here. And they will have continuity and follow up. Here, one JS does it, he goes away, next JS comes, doesn't know. So, not only is it a loss of continuity, it is a loss of passion. So, hopefully, when you have smaller teams, they will do this. Another problem was we were never able to explain what internal finance wanted to all our implementing partners. And with every change in internal finance, this demand would change. So many of our partners had to hire extra people simply to deal with their financier who was NEA or other ministries. Now, this was something which was unanticipated. We never said that every organization will have to have, but this is how I think they deal with aid agencies in other countries. You find a few experts who know how to deal with the systems in those agencies. And that is where the gap took place. Third, we kept changing our rules internally. As a result, it became more difficult, and more of our grant projects were handled by our public sector units only. And they never had a business sense to convert that into a further business. But if you had given it to the private sector guy to run, he would have used that as a stepping stone to create business like it happened under the line of credit projects. So these were some of the findings we found. Yes, it is not that all the companies who implemented projects were either the best or did the best job. But enough succeeded to give you a good impression.
Very good. Thank you, Gurjit. It has been a nostalgic experience talking to you like this after several years. And certainly you have done a great service to India-Africa relations through this book. And it has opened our eyes to many, many things. But things don't change very fast in India. You have to work at it over and over again. And then only the full potential can be realized. But you have done a great service by writing this book. I know it must have been a great effort. Where you got those sources, where you got the statistics, I don't know. And so thank you very much and congratulations on the success.
Thank you very much, sir, for your extremely gracious gesture. And I wish you good health. And I can see that your smile is the same since I worked with you in Kenya. And I wish you and your wife the very best ahead, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. We have very warm memories about you and the family. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.